Good evening. If you have your Bibles, okay. Let me begin by thanking the people who have made this event possible. Darius Carter, Maria McWhirter, Morgan L. Davis, Claudia Morales, and Michelle L. Glimpf. Likewise, gratitude to people from near and far, known and unknown, who have decided to spend their Thursday evenings with me. The outline of my talk will occur in two parts, an introduction to my research and an examination of Marvin Gaye from the third chapter of my book. To that end, I have started the custom that for any kind of talk I give, I dedicate it to people foremost in my mind at that moment. So for tonight, I want to dedicate this occasion to the Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden. The introduction. If I told you that the life of Marvin Gaye conversed with the work of Sigmund Freud, you would likely wonder who conferred my PhD to me. Yet somehow the intersections of psychoanalysis, namely its conception of melancholy, genius, and Black life, seemed a germane ground for me to launch and later publish my work, Stay Black and Die, on Melancholy and Genius. For what it's worth, too, you'll see black slides, that's on purpose. The starting point for such a combination is a bit of theory on the origins of Freudian melancholy, then a pivot to genius before unpacking Black life through the guise of the blues. That said, let's begin. In Freud's 1917 treatise, Mourning and Melancholia, he suggests that the psychic loss of the loved object, the mother, or, quote, some abstraction such as one's country, liberty, an ideal, and so on, constitutes melancholy. In turn, the one experiencing this loss desires to harm while simultaneously becoming what he calls the lost object. Stay Black and Die initiates itself by taking seriously that idea and then extending it to ponder, given the gravity of love and loss, what insights might emerge if this feminine/maternal figure is Black, most especially since the inception of psychoanalysis in late 19th century Europe signified that Freud was not speaking to me. Thus, if the Black feminine/maternal is quote-unquote lost, this project finds her in and through performances of excellence, which I call genius, that implicate both her and her child. The idea of genius is itself complicated due to its etymology and its outward presentation. On the one hand, classical Latin suggests that a genius is, quote, a male spirit of a family, existing in the head of the family, and subsequently in the divine or spiritual part of each individual. The ending of the word has, quote, a base ultimately related to that of generare, to beget, and a syntactical link to the word genital. The term reads one-sided, in that the gender component elides femininity, i.e., throughout culture, psychoanalytic and otherwise, masculinity is the privileged side of intellect. Numerous thinkers provide a counterpoint to these provocations, particularly those engaged in Black feminist thought. And for what it's worth, I also want to acknowledge one of my mentors who's here, Mary Helen Washington. In a passage on the genius of Billie Holiday, Fair Jasmine Griffin theorizes, quote, Black women were thought to be incapable of possessing genius. All persons of African descent were thought to be unfit for advanced intellectual endeavor. Black women in particular were body, feeling, emotion, and sexuality. By genius, I mean the special quality of mind and aptitudes that some individuals have innately for specific tasks or kinds of work. Artistic success in this form requires talent, intelligence, and discipline, end quote. Griffin shifts the paradigm by historicizing a tradition of Black women creatives unlocated in certain dominant narratives of knowledge and aesthetic production. She also exerts pressure on how Black women have been regarded over time, reimagining the measure of their aptitude through genius possession. Rachel M. Harper equally exposits such acuity when she asserts that genius is emblematic of Black cool. Quote, we Black artists turn our loss, our heartache into art. We give it life. So it then exists beyond our own bodies, our own selves, becoming timeless and universal. What in the end is more cool than that? We look at those artists, so she's talking about Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, John Coltrane, Richard Pryor, and Jean-Michel Basquiat. As we look upon our mothers during childbirth, We don't want them to suffer in order to bring us into the world, but we are damn happy to be alive, end quote. Harper divorces the act of birth from the constructs of gender. As well, one testifies to how the very body that begets someone can induce the possibility for the begotten to perform that same act in turn. Psychoanalytically, this is called identification, quote, the expression of there being something in common which may signify love, end quote. This exemplifies the intervention of Stay Black and Die. To be clear, I do not approach the category of the black feminine / maternal through the guise of romance. By looking at this persona as a composite figure in traditional and non-traditional manners, the book charts how ordinary, or better still, melancholic beginnings have spectacular ends. When considering genius, I, akin to Dion Brand, am not enthralled by doing, or for that matter, praising the black spectacular, even as I affirm, and to an extent have gratitude for, certain outbursts of these expressions. This is because we too easily remain enamored with the output while harboring border for the origin. Stay Black and Die, then, claims genius and its excesses as the simplicity of Frederick Douglass's ability to read, Ralph Ellison's internalization of a riddle, Octavia Butler's protagonist harvesting a rifle, and Kendrick Lamar's desire to soar. All these performances are enabled by the black feminine / maternal. In this way, I believe Freud too highlights something like genius when he writes, all such states such as joy, exultation, or triumph, which give us the normal model for mania, depend on the same economic conditions. All such situations are characterized by high spirits, by the signs of discharge of joyful emotion, and by increased readiness for all kinds of action, in just the same way as in mania, and in complete contrast to the depression and inhibition of melancholia. By giving primacy to black studies in this work on race and psychoanalysis, my methodology imposes Freud's enunciation in what Albert Murray calls the blues idiom, quote, Negroes invented the blues, Europeans invented psychoanalysis. You invent what you need. The blues as such is depression, melancholia. Blues as music is a way of making an aesthetic statement with sound. Conventional Americans think Negroes are crying when they're singing the blues. They're not. They're getting ready to have a good time. Said differently, instead of utilizing secondary sources to explain Freud and then read that criticism to evidence blackness, the subjects of this project are Freud's interlocutors. As a form of expression and interpretation in black thought writ large, genius is a response to and a performance in excess of one's melancholy. Genius, not mania, is a vestige of melancholy that is at once reducible and irreducible to the mother. Therefore, Stay Black and Die chronicles the black feminine / maternal no longer as an object lost, but a subject found. 1. Do you hear what I hear? On a first listen of Marvin Gaye's Trouble Man, the instrumental frenzy that is the introductory bars, the snare and cymbals, the violins, the xylophone, the piano, the percussive, and the stringed, fully aware that there are lyrics but equally unaware as to what they might be, the brain commences its own fashioning of rewind. If not for the ability to Google the lyrics or the record company's publication of the liner notes, audio files would be left in the dark. When the tenor Gaye begins singing on the record, it sounds like he enunciates, I come apart, baby. But now I'm cool, I didn't make it sugar, playing by the rules. A lyric search ensues post listening for clarification, only to show that he actually confesses. I come up hard, baby. But is it improper to admit a personal and theoretical desire for what I thought I saw through hearing in lieu of what was songwritten? This ear puzzle, invoked as ambient listening, illumines the aims of this moment, but seems amiss as if going in one ear and out the other. Coming up hard, as opposed to coming apart or even I come a part, baby, sonically appears to stage Gaye's desire to jumble his words, mindful that the scrambling is emblematic of his own upbringing. This is to say, coming up hard / apart might convey in no uncertain terms, quote, I don't mean to say that I have already achieved these things or that I have already reached perfection, but I focus on this one thing, forgetting the past and looking forward to what lies ahead. I press on to reach the end of the race and receive the heavenly prize, end quote. One notes this affinity for forgetting the past and looking forward when acknowledging that Gaye had a hand in suppressing the words to Trouble Man for roughly a decade after its recording. Quote, Strangely, the lyrics didn't appear on the sleeve as they had on What's Going On. In fact, it wasn't until 1982 when he left Motown to join CBS that Marvin reprinted the lyrics on the album. Why? This is Marvin speaking. I respect poetry, Gaye answered, and I try to write it subtly, but lyrics really aren't poems. Printing them like poems can make them seem silly. Besides, I like the idea of everyone guessing at what I'm singing. I like mystery. This search to know, with relative listening ease, regarding what Gaye sings offers the listener an opportunity to be haunted by his compositional and aesthetic decisions. These opening remarks mean to highlight how practitioners in the Black aesthetic tradition are perhaps always and ever capable of talking to the otherworldly or the dead, and that such a correspondence is wholly communal, dare one say, reparational. In effect, this practice of speaking with the dead often means to edify the living. I call this glossolalia. This new term riffs on the words glossolalia, which connotes speaking in tongues as the outpouring of the Spirit on the day of Pentecost in the book of Acts in the New Testament. And ironically enough, this Sunday is Pentecost. So perhaps this was serendipitous for me to be here. The aim of this new word is to situate how hypernormal communication, whether through word or song, manifests as an act of the everyday ghost. So too, this chronicle of what happens when one receives an invitation to partake in such a communicative endeavor, contriving trouble man as precisely such a call. Therefore, does Gaye's life and his penning and performance of this song for a film of the same name have its complement in a work of theory, namely Hortense J. Spiller's Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American Grammar Book, and at what cost? To answer these questions, one must in fact go to the movies, or better still, the soundtrack, to commence moving down the line. The birth of Marvin Gaye provides a window into how one begins to glimpse his melancholy and genius. This is part 2. Marvin Pence Gaye Jr. was born at Freedman's Hospital in Washington, D.C. on April 2nd, 1939, a Sunday, the same day of the week he died. In the same city, exactly 1 week later, the great Black contralto Marian Anderson, barred from singing at Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution, would perform at the Lincoln Memorial before 75,000 spectators on Easter morning. I felt a kinship to Miss Anderson, just as I'd always feel a great kinship with Miss Mahalia Jackson. My father himself had a great voice and the capacity to become a great singer. Early on, I realized largely through dreams that I too was destined to be such a singer. Marvin had precise recollections of childhood dreams, but were these dreams engendered while awake or asleep? Both, he replied with an inflection both regal and street. They were more visions than dreams, visions of myself on stage, while all the world watched and waited for me to sing something so stupendous that life as we know it would forever be altered. I was brought here to make a change. In this brief excerpt from David Ritz's Divided Soul, The Life of Marvin Gaye, he allows us entree into the possibility of Gaye being born to live a life worth singing, to acknowledge that a child born to a named affiliation is birthed under the shelter of a freedman's neonatal nursery, that what was meant for evil was turned to good in the person and works of Miss Anderson, the contralto foremother of Marvin, that Mahalia Jackson in her dark soprano timbre can be heard saying to Marvin, instead of Martin Luther, through the annals of the Black radical tradition, "Tell them about the dream, Marvin." That music is an inheritance passed down by the one who despises you the most, the one whom you also stunningly become. That what could have been a dream deferred does explode with such force that it troubles the body to wakefulness, a sleepwalker's eye-opening inversion, at times yet asleep. That a wonderful change could come over a man whose nostalgia as a juvenile visionary enables him to code switch, conveying to the biographer the King's English and the hoodies of the Urban Dictionary in a single word. The triumph of Gaye's reverence for Anderson and Jackson is that he channels what Hortense Spillers calls the power of yes to the female within. This is concurrent to Marvin being deemed his father's child. Just as arresting, fully cognizant of the Judeo-Christian liturgical calendar, is that Anderson's Sunrise Surprise on Easter compels sitting with the fact that Marvin Gaye, born a week earlier on April 2nd, 1939, makes his own triumphant entry into the New Jerusalem that is this nation's capital on Palm Sunday. Likewise, in Rich's chapter in the beginning, one learns that, quote, "My husband never wanted Marvin," Mrs. Gaye told me, and he never liked him. He used to say that he didn't think he was really his child. I told him that was nonsense. He knew Marvin was his, but for some reason he didn't love Marvin, and what's worse, he didn't want me to love Marvin either. Marvin wasn't very old before he understood that. The tragic triangle was established at birth, father and son competing for mother's love, a tension that only grew over the years, finally exploding in 2 angry blasts of gunfire. The father, ending his son's existence, that very son being beloved because he is his namesake, foretells Gay's melancholy because it conveys an anxiety over death that will be accomplished by the father. It would appear not only that Gay's life is paraliturgical, but also that such a life becomes the nodal point for comprehending what it means to be wanted by the very persons who will lay in wait for your descent, and then voice dissent regarding such a fall. Here, I'm interested in Ritz saying that Marvin and his father, the father and the son, are competing for the mother's love, and in the ways that he kind of suggests a kind of trinity, right? Father, son, mother's love. And then, of course, again, with him entering, being born on Palm Sunday here in D.C., that, like that triumphant entry is then the catalyst before Christ is killed. And so, of course, then what comes to mind is Isaiah 53. There was nothing beautiful or majestic about his appearance, nothing to attract us to him. He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows acquainted with the deepest grief. All of this religious rhetoric would not be lost on the son. Father was a pastor. The church was the homestead. And father chastises the son as a means of strict adherence to his law. It wasn't simply that father beat me, though that was bad enough. By the time I was 12, there wasn't an inch of my body that hadn't been bruised and beaten by him. But father did something else far worse. You see, he's a man with a subtle mind. He understood that if you're interested in inflicting pain, prolonging the process adds to the excitement. The only way to short-circuit the agony was to provoke him even more and just get the beating over with. When he finally struck me, I knew, children know these things, that something inside him was enjoying the whole thing. I thought I could win his love through singing, so I sang my heart out. I could never please him, and if it wasn't for mother, who was always there to console me and praise my singing, I think I would have been one of those child suicide cases you read about in the papers. Here, Gay invokes what psychoanalysis would call the death drive, casting himself in company with the likes of Richard Wright and James Baldwin, and that all three can cite parental behaviors along the lines of religiosity and right as circumventing whatever calling is existent to mete out grace as it has previously been given. The Gay home as church constructs itself as a site of a kind of plantation where disobedience to discipleship provokes the threat, promise, and manifestation of, quote, specifically externalized acts of torture and prostration that we imagine as the peculiar province of male brutality and torture inflicted by other males. This short circuit incites a perusal of system of impulses, most often bodily, that materialize in the father who has, quote, popped his son's flesh open. One is astonished not only that Marvin is the pain receptor, but also that this violence endows the reader and the listener with the capacity to reread what Spillers calls the hieroglyphics of the flesh. The raising of Marvin's skin is the earliest musical lesson for him in discerning and sight reading the sheet music that is his body as a composition. Quote, the extended movement of a specific upheaval, the ongoing eruption that arranges every line, a strain that pressures the assumption of the equivalence of personhood and subjectivity. However, what would appear to be the gay disciplinarian's critical distance, as extended from his hand to the end of his switch, making contact with his namesake's corpus, actually posits a manner of twisted intimacy. Ritz's second chapter, Original Sin, is the name of the chapter, points to the chaos inherent in Gay's natal community and his defiance of it. However, it also engenders what will be understood in chapter 3 to be sexual confusion, a presumptive nod to Marvin Gaye's future call for healing. Might such music be the resistance of the object who is Marvin Gaye? The move to speak about homebound discipline as a mode of intimacy, in part, comes from what is viewed as a form of rage. Given mother's admission of familial crime, and the neighbor's account in the biography that, quote, Mr. Gay's violent streak was especially sad and hurtful because he'd tell me how his own father, back in Kentucky, would beat his wife, Mr. Gay's mother. He described the blood and the horror he saw, end quote. The father, as the quintessential product of his environment, retains a memory of domestic abuse that finds its enactment in and throughout his own household, the church, the site of both praise and punishment. Father perpetuates an oppressive love that puts into relief what might contemporarily be called giving queer realness. A strong sexual ambiguity surrounding Mr. Gaye was something Ritz noticed the first time I met him in 1979. His speech and body language were soft and overtly feminine. My father likes to wear women's clothing. As you well know, that doesn't mean he's homosexual. In fact, my father was always known as a ladies' man. There have been periods where his hair was very long and curled under, and when he seemed quite adamant in showing the world the girlish side of himself. That may have been to further embarrass me. I find the situation all the more difficult because, to tell you the truth, I have the same fascination with women's clothes. In my case, that has nothing to do with any attraction for men. Sexually, men don't interest me, but seeing myself as a woman is something that intrigues me. It is also something I fear. I indulge myself only at the most discreet and intimate moments. After all, indulgence of the flesh is wicked, no matter what your kick. The hot stuff is lethal. I've never been able to stay away from the hot stuff. Marvin's admission that he too finds intrigue and action in his father's stylistic pastime prepares us for the sacramental on par with communion. Junior, Marvin Gaye Jr. that is, steps into the avatar that is his father as Sapphire, as he, quote, enacts his old man in drag, just as his old man becomes Sapphire in outrageous caricature. 3. When Gaye meets Gershwin, the operatics of Trouble Man. The trouble of masculinity marks Gaye's upbringing as a problem until he becomes his own man. He creates a subversive persona on the record I previously played in order to be acquainted with his deeper self. David Ritz writes, Trouble Man was one of only 2 albums where Gaye wrote every song alone. He lost himself in the mood of the movie, a mood corresponding to the dark side of his own soul. The transitions from the lofty spirituality of What's Going On to the bleak pessimism of Trouble Man was astounding, though no more astounding than the contradictions in Marvin's personality. In it, he identified with the hero-victim, bringing to the suite a distinctively, frighteningly autobiographical voice, end quote. The album as autobiography troubles the history of the book, in that it reifies anew the genius and once conceived naivete of O Lauda Equiano and the foresight of Stevie Wonder. There is such a thing as a talking book. If the listener, like Equiano, takes Trouble Man and puts her ears to it when alone, and hopes it would answer, that audible living history vocalizes so pristinely that it foreshadows what was once referred to as the story of the tribe. Gaye sings himself into a sound that gives way to Ritz's titular offering of his divided soul, the gangster and the preacher's kid, the sexual healer and the painfully shy guy, the daughter and the son, mama's baby and papa's maybe. And here, given what I've said about these kinds of contradictions around the fear of the feminine and this desire to be masculine, I'm very much interested in the fact that Marvin Gaye in the 70s took up boxing. At one point he tried to be a boxer. He also tried to walk on for the Detroit Lions. So again, he's kind of straddling these worlds around the feminine and the masculine and really trying to work through what I read as a lot of the trauma that's happening from his childhood. To behold an album where only one track holds any form of vocality becomes the reading of a grammar book that transcends category, even if the European avant-garde hearer considers it quote-unquote innovative. The singularity of this Gaye grammar book is found in its necessity to have him self-fashion a complex story about his persona and his communion with evil, the dark side of his own soul, and his fascination with the underworld. Moreover, the provocation of a talking book reveals something along the lines of Spiller's grammar book. However, it may be better to rename such literature the American Songbook based on Gaye's inspiration. Quote, talking about Trouble Man, "This is probably my favorite work," Marvin told me, though he said the same thing about I Want You. I was listening to a great deal of Gershwin at the time, and I really wanted to do something great. I was amazed at my concentration. It had never been this intense before, end quote. This admission pushes us toward our next immediate inquiry regarding Trouble Man and its creation. What Gershwin was Marvin Gaye listening to? I believe Gaye was likely listening to Porgy and Bess, more assuredly My Man's Gone Now, in order to reinterpret the character Serena's scream. If the scream and the subsequent ruminations on it becomes the medium through which glossolalia occasions itself, what one yearns for now is a mode of translation. Therefore, this translation of a translation, along the lines of risk and stress, privileges us with the opportunity to taste Marvin Gaye's archive. No different than how one wears her hat or sips his tea, this subsequent interpretation will be eviscerated beyond utility into a synonym of culture itself. My Man's Gone Now poses a resonant performative interjection for our musings, because not only does the aria's premise presuppose a similitude of operatic proportions, but it also presents a manner of communalism, purposed and proposed by auxiliary characters and not protagonists. The libretto of Porgy and Bess precedent to the aria is that Serena has lost her husband Robbins at the hands of Crown during a crap game in Catfish Row. But the affect that lends a necessary reading to our overarching thematic is that the wake and funeral being held for Robbins takes place inside his and Serena's home, and that she has invited, albeit explicitly one conceives, the people of Catfish Row into said home to carry out a proper send-off. That said, My Man's Gone Now is pivotal to our considerations because of its call and response. In listening to the aria, Serena sings by herself until she looks melancholy in its face and announces that she lose her man. But the ensemble, noticeably unprovoked, stands beside and sits with her in mourning and sings back what she sings, only to have her repeat it again. Since I/she lose my/her man. The remainder of the song occurs with the ensemble simply accompanying Serena in the background until the last lyrical line, and for lack of a better term, the vamp. The last utterance of Since I Lose My Man has an approach that belies Serena's overall sentimentality. In a moment of multiple octave swoon and boom, Serena sings up the scale until she pitches a high B5 on the lyric since, I sung on an A5, lose now a lyric polysyllable, transitions back to the B5, then to the A5, my on the G5, and man in the E5. Serena, the lyric soprano, the newfound widow, issues her operatic blues in the fifth pianistic octave. All the more interesting is subsequent to the scream. There's a terse musical interlude where the orchestra plays, as a form of mimicry, the opening lyrical chords of the aria instrumentally. Then it happens. The orchestra loses itself, becoming quasi-silent. In that relative absence, we find the ensemble crescendoing to its own collective scream that finds its operatic conclusion in Serena screaming a new and ineffable B5. She does not enunciate lyrics, she simply screams, with an orchestral thud pronouncing the aria's finality. I find it not so coincidental that in my own dalliances in classical training, one of my instructors said that singing operatically is a process in learning the proper way to scream. One believes Gaye to have been listening to My Man's Gone Now as the muse for Trouble Man because he engages in aesthetic sampling from the aria, an orchestral arrangement that often mimics the form and frame in which he sings, the A-B skeleton of verses, and a terse makeshift chorus, the dynamic quality. But just as similar is the fact that Marvin himself screams. He has this moment of clarity that, I might add, has rhetorically become pop cultural go-to. Quote, there's only three things that's for sure: taxes, death, and trouble. This I know, baby. This I know, sugar. And then he sings, I won't let it sweat me, babe, which is followed by a brief orchestral interlude of quasi-silence, where the instruments layer themselves upon themselves, gaining in volume. They're heard in a steady procession, and then Marvin swings, got me singing, yeah, yeah. This instance of the Gaye scream, realizing the nuances of the human voice, is stupefying, because it is basically the only instance in Trouble Man when Marvin sings from his chest voice, often called a belt, because the rest of the song is predominantly sung in his head voice, or better yet, his falsetto. So, In light of this argument around this fear of the feminine and this kind of wrestling with the masculine, some of what I'm interested in is if Marvin Gaye was listening to Gershwin, in particular, Porgy and Bess, My Men's Going Now, how he would have interpolated or sampled that in Trouble Man. So what's also interesting about what I think are the harmonics that he's listening to, inclusive of him singing the beginning of Trouble Man in the falsetto, is that he could also very easily have been thinking about summertime. So there are a couple of different moments in the opera where that kind of harmonic register could have been interpolated or sampled by Marvin Gaye. In Stephen Harney and Fred Moulton's work, The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning, and Black Study, they account for the peculiar moment that epitomizes Gaye's falsetto. 7, but blackness still has work to do, to discover the rerouting encoded in the work of art, and the anachoreographic reset of a shoulder, and the quiet extremities that animate a range of social chromaticisms, and especially in the mutations that drive mute, labored music speech as it moves between an incapacity for reasoned or meaningful self-generated utterance that is on the one hand supposed and on the other hand imposed, and a critical predisposition to steal away. In those mutations that are always also a regendering or transgendering, as in Al Green's errant falsetto, or Big Maybell's bass, which is not but nothing other than basic growl. And in between that impropriety of speech that approaches animality and the tendency towards expropriation, that approaches criminality, lies blackness, lies the black thing that cuts the regulative, governant force of the understanding, and even of those understandings of blackness to which black people are given, since fugitivity escapes even the fugitive. Cognizant of the necessity of the microphone for amplification, the voice simultaneously produces and breaks apart from the reducible limit its originator is placing on it, as manifested whether in a crescendo or an aria's culmination through the scream. This requires understanding the mechanics of the voice in such an oral endeavor. Quote, when viewed through a stroboscope, in our modal voice, the vocal folds are seen to make contact with each other completely during each vibration, closing the gap between them fully, if just for a very short time. This closure cuts off the escaping air. When the air pressure in the trachea rises as a result, the folds are blown apart. In falsetto, however, when the vocal folds are blown open, a permanent oval orifice is left in the middle between the edges of the two folds, through which a certain volume of air escapes continuously as long as phonation continues. So what this basically means is that as I'm talking to you, my vocal cords are moving like this. But when I sing in falsetto, my vocal cords go like this. And I'm interested in that movement of his voice in that song, especially because he begins Trouble Man like this, and when he screams, he ends up like this. Marvin's scream of yeah is the modal structure of his vocal flesh coming together, as preceded by the corporeal falsity of his twin chords coming apart, the oval and the masculine interior, or what Jacques Derrida refers to as, quote, an internal pocket larger than the whole, and the outcome of a division and of an abounding that remains singular as it is limitless. By coming apart, Gaye affirms Spiller's reading of the black autobiographical tradition in that the project of liberation for African Americans has found urgency in two passionate motivations that are twinned. One, to break apart, to rupture violently the laws of American behavior that make such syntax possible. And two, to introduce a new semantic field/fold more appropriate to his/her own historic movement. Marvin's falsetto is the rendering of the indescribable because, like Serena, one notes perplexity in that personification of a trouble man, in that Marvin Gaye could be calling out the haphazard sovereign or hegemony writ large. Although one reasons that Gaye is in fact the trouble man, he divorces the listener from that notion when he calls the trouble man out, stating, quote, don't get in my way. Yet the clarion call for the trouble man remains thought-provoking in that a weird dissociation does occur. Marvin, like Serena, converses with someone for the song's entirety. But if one parses out I come up hard/apart baby, could it be that Marvin is singing to his boyhood, the man-child in the never-promised land that is the sphere of dominant cultural masculinity? Or could it be that the aforementioned fugitive planners are onto something when they invoke regendering or transgendering via the falsetto? If Marvin as son becomes the child his father never but then again always wanted, then when the song's dialogue names baby and sugar, Perhaps Gaye is situating his voice as an intimate rendezvous through soundscape with and as the quote-unquote woman he earlier conceived as a point of intrigue. This is Marvin saying yes to the power of female within as his very own self. This is Marvin's rendition of Mary J. Blige's Love No Limit as an inmate in solitary confinement. This is Gaye espousing Edouard Glissant's notion of consent to not be a single being. This is Michel Foucault. Did he ever listen to Marvin Gaye or read George Gershwin's opera? As a witness in the great cloud of Blaxploitation that, quote, we will be astonished, no doubt, that we were capable of identifying such a strange kinship between what for a long time was dreaded like a scream and what for a long time was considered a song, end quote. But the story does not end here. In other words, I would be remiss, given that this is Black Music Month, to highlight another moment of close listening of one of Marvin Gaye's contemporaries, and this story begins, as most do, with a memory. When I first moved south to do my doctoral work, literally the first weekend, my Aunt Willa Carlton, who is celebrating her birthday tomorrow, so I want to shout her out, a rather well-known piano teacher in town, took me to an event for people of her ilk, a play-in for instructors. A makeshift piano recital of sorts, the occasion provided members of the Piano Teachers Guild an opportunity to come together a handful of Sundays throughout the year to celebrate their mutual joy of that percussive instrument. Nevertheless, that singular occasion elicits my contemplation now around the classical tradition, melancholy and genius in Black culture and media. At one point during the recital, an older woman, tall in stature yet somehow unassuming, stepped to the keyboard. My aunt leaned over to me and said something to the effect of, "This woman always attends these. She stopped teaching some years ago due to early onset dementia, but whenever she comes, she plays a whole piece by heart." I replied with my usual sentiment, but was more interested in seeing what this woman was about to pull off on the piano stool, and so she began to play. I gasped. I've heard this song before, maybe not in its entirety, maybe, but certainly on those infomercials for the Time Life box set of classical music standards. I gasped. Did anyone else hear that? What I heard? I gasped. How did I miss something so obvious that now confuses my ear? I gasped. Did he do what I think he did? And why did no one ever tell me? I gasped. I sang a song for you for my capstone in high school. Some years later, I sang it again at a friend's wedding, and there is evidence. The first time I remember hearing this song was on the TV show Gideon's Crossing, when it started playing at the end of an episode as actor Russell Hornsby started crying for what I do not recall. No doubt the song played in spaces where I was present, but I remember this specific sonic event because my mother had a visceral reaction to the song choice when I asked her who it was. She said it was Donny Hathaway. Soon after that, I purchased a Donny Hathaway collection on an antiquated contraption commonly known as a CD. Nevertheless, this occurrence compelled me to do my work. The rigor invested in Marvin Gaye through close listening provides me entree to think more acutely about Black listening practices, more specifically how Black people rethink the classical tradition to narrate their melancholy as acts of genius. In my forthcoming book, Be Real Black for Me, about the matter of Roberta Flack, Flack shares that when she recorded her debut album First Take, quote, executives said, come to New York and we want you to just go into the studio. How many songs do you know? I said about 600 songs. Of course, that included all of the classical music, all the Bach, the Chopin, and they said, well, we'd like for you to do some. We'll just set you up. We went in, I recorded 40 songs. The 10 or 11 songs that are on that album were from that session. And they called that album First Take because I did them in like one take. End quote. Is it possible that Johann Sebastian or Frederick influenced how she executes The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face, or Ballad of the Sad Young Men? In like manner, though these Donny Hathaway musings are a part of a larger project in my head, the darkness and atonality of A Song for You seems a broader concern for him. In an interview referencing Stravinsky, he states, quote, he uses the timpanis like a primitive person would use the timpanis. That was one of the things that Coltrane added to music from studying people like Ravel, who had written symphonies, who had exhausted music to the point of just writing chords that were atonal and didn't have any harmony at all, just colors, clusters, end quote. Nevertheless, all this information provokes from me the question of who Hathaway's you is, partly because Lish Liebestraum No. 3, which Song for You samples, was set to a poem where the first stanza reads, quote, oh, love, as long as love you can. Oh, love, as long as love you may. The time will come, when you will stand at the grave and mourn. Perhaps the realization, like Trouble Man, but unlike Freud, is that Hathaway is speaking, singing to me to prove that I have been let in on his secret. This is akin to Gaye speculatively interpolating My Man's Gone Now and forcing me to reckon with the sameness and difference between apart and up hard. In conclusion, this snapshot of Melancholy and Genius exhibits what I deem staying Black and dying as revealed through the Black feminine / maternal in manifold iterations. At the same time, it also brings to mind my own formulation of what the colloquialism means. When I, as young children are prone to do, entreated of my parents, I need X, my mother almost always responded, all you need to do is stay Black and die. As relayed by my mother, the aphorism problematizes melancholy because it conflates racial preservation love with death loss as a necessity on par with Langston Hughes, who suggests, work, I don't have to work. I don't have to do nothing but eat, drink, stay Black, and die. Therefore, perhaps when one is encouraged to stay Black and die, that admonition gestures not only to a form of effective labor, something that we might call life. Thank you.
Dr. Durham. How about another round of applause for that? Fantastic. So I kind of want to go back to Marian Anderson and her connection with Marvin Gaye. and potentially a connection there between the concept you introduced briefly that we could talk about for hours,
Yes.
Gostolalia. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yes. So some of what I'm interested in with him saying that he has kinship with Marian Anderson and Mahalia Jackson is that in writings about Trouble Man, it suggests that it has a kind of gospel-fied feel in some of the chords. And at the same time, for me, the falsetto is a register of singing that is most often, kind of read through a certain kind of operatic sound or kind of sonic quality. So when he says I had a kind of kinship with Marian Anderson and Mahalia Jackson, to me, Trouble Man is almost kind of like the blending of both of those things at once. So that the falsetto seems to me a kind of homage, perhaps to Marian Anderson, among other people. And then that kind of gospel-fied sound, that screaming of yeah that happens is kind of like that gospel guttural kind of thing that he would have known just based on having grown up in the church and singing. But also I think just the fact that he was, singing with in Motown. I think what's also interesting as I think about the question of Marian Anderson is that, and this is something that I have learned from one of my other mentors, Mark Anthony Neal, is that there's a way that Marvin Gaye is what I'd call an archival singer. And what I mean by that is that he's listening quite broadly to a lot of different things in order to kind of draw on inspiration. So one of the things he was also listening to in this period, so this is the period where Motown has left Detroit and has moved to LA. And in part because they want to start making films. So you think about like Mahogany, for example.
What year?
Marvin Gaye is there in 1972. I believe it's 1972. And so he's listening to like Beethoven. He's listening to a lot of classical composers because the other thing that's happening in this moment is that he is noticing that a lot of his contemporaries like Isaac Hayes, Donny Hathaway are also composing film soundtracks. So one of the reasons why he even is thinking about Trouble Man and composing it is because he sees other contemporaries doing that. So he's listening to the classical, he's listening to his contemporaries, but also there's a period in Marvin Gaye's career where he seems to have a kind of interesting investment in, the American Songbook. So he's listening to like Frank Sinatra, right? So to me, as I think about him as a kind of archival singer, it would make sense that he was likely listening to opera, right? And certainly Marian Anderson, but also listening to Mahalia Jackson and others, on top of whatever he's listening to in and through Motown, right? The last thing I'll say about Marian Anderson and the influence that I think is also important, and maybe also kind of plays into the Gostolalia, is that at Motown, they had this kind of preoccupation with how the musicians sounded while they sang. And what I mean by that is that sometimes, and Marvin Gaye says this, they would pitch his music too high so that it would sound like he was screaming. But really, in order to kind of simulate him begging, right? And so Lamont Dozier, there's an interview where Lamont Dozier basically says he would slide into his falsetto in order to hit the notes that were too high for him. But it's not only just that this is happening to male performers. There's an interview that Gladys Knight does. Gladys Knight is also saying they would pitch my music way too high, right? So I would say Gladys Knight, when I think about Levi Stubbs and the Four Tops, if you listen to the song like Bernadette, he is screaming. It is very, very, it's way too high for him, right? So in those ways, I also see the influence of Marian Anderson because in some ways, given how music producers are pitching his music, the falsetto is his way out. It's his way to be able to sing music that's too high. And so again, I'm thinking he must have been listening to a broad range of music. And again, for him to say he had a kinship with Mahalia Jackson and Marian Anderson, it feels like to me that manifests in his voice.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I can see those connections. Speaking of more connections, so Trouble Man and this operatic influence that he borrows from Gershwin, and thinking about how the score is sparse when you're actually listening to it throughout the movie. Can you talk a little bit about some of the operatic influences from Gershwin that you're actually hearing in the score without words.
So what's interesting about Trouble Man is that, as Morgan was saying, when you listen to the album, it's quite empty. There's a lot of silences, and for the most part, the only song where there's actually full singing is Trouble Man, which happens really at the beginning of the album. There are like a couple of kind of musical interludes, right? For me, I think, for a while I was thinking maybe there's like Rhapsody in Blue somewhere like in there. I don't think that really emerges. I think it really is Porgy and Bess. And I think that also because, like I said, if I'm listening to Trouble Man and hearing what I think are the harmonics of My Man's Gone Now, certainly there's a way that Summertime also seems to have a similar kind of harmonic register. There are a couple of other moments in the opera too that have that. But I think for me, like, the fact that he was listening to Gershwin and listening to Beethoven, so that in a lot of ways it's as if, and again, I think My Man's Going Now really bears this out. As I was saying, there's a moment when the orchestra drops out and there's complete silence. It feels like he is kind of getting influenced about the silences that are happening on Trouble Man by way of Gershwin and some of what I think is happening in Porgy and Bess. But again, for a while I was trying to figure out, like, should I be thinking more broadly about Gershwin? Like, you know, is there some Gershwin that I haven't listened to that maybe? But to me, it just seemed also resonant given that with me writing about Marvin Gaye's masculinity and certainly writing about his childhood, that My Man's Gone Now felt totally appropriate to think about, in part because, as I said, it seems like Serena is having, in fact, there's a moment in the aria where she says, "Old Man Sorrow." She actually calls out "Old Man Sorrow," which seemed to me to be rather germane to what I was interested in. So again, I think it's Porgy and Bess. I know for sure it's My Man's Going Now. I think there's some Summertime there. But again, I think that he's listening to so many such a broad archive that I think it really does manifest in Trouble Man, among other things that are happening on that soundtrack.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want to come back to that, but I also would like to touch on this idea of melancholy. And full disclosure, I am not a Freudian scholar,
Okay.
so I did my best.
Am I? No, I'm just kidding.
A lot closer
Yeah,
than me.
right.
So Freud's discourse on melancholy seems to operate around this idea of a lost object, a person, an idea. We've sort of talked about this relationship, this kinship with Marian Anderson, with Mahalia Jackson. And the way that melancholia spins out in your work, to me, it reads sort of as the object as the black feminine maternal, which for the purposes of this question, I'm connecting to those women. But also juxtaposing this loss against an absent or sort of constantly in flux black patrilineal object. The more I read, the more those two objects seem to become increasingly inextricable. Can you give us some more insight into how you intended for the black feminine maternal to operate in dialogue with the black patrilineal object, either wholly absent or perpetually in flux? I'm thinking particularly of the chapters Reed, Frederick, and of course, Man, Marvin. This is from his book, Stay Black and Die, which we're talking about.
Yes.
Please indulge us.
Yes, that's a great question. I mean, not to get too deeply into kind of like the theoretical weeds, some of what I'm interested in is the idea that oftentimes when we think about genius, it's only ever rendered through the masculine. So it is the man, and even as I said, at the level of the etymology of the word, one of the etymological references is the male of the family. And so there's a lot of work, you know, coming out of like, you know, classical theory around humors and, you know, your body giving off these like vapors, you know, this kind of thing, right? But then also there's a lot of work around notions of like the womb, you know, that the woman can carry genius but can never be genius. And so for me, what was interesting in these figures, and again, why I think the moment of him saying Mahalia Jackson and Mary Anderson as kin is interesting to me is that in a lot of ways, oftentimes we think that when these men perform genius, they're performing it and it's a mark of their self-making. And so for me, I'm much more interested in like, actually, if we peel back the layers to see what was Marvin Gaye listening to? Or, you know, in the case of Frederick Douglass, what do we do with the rumor that he gives around his mother? For what it's worth, there's a rumor that Frederick Douglass shares where he says, in this part of Maryland where I was growing up, my mother was the only slave who knew how to read. And so from there, he basically suggests, so any love of letters that I have is from this sable genius who was my mother. I'm very much interested in peeling back the layers of one's self-making to actually find the origin or the beginning of how that kind of making comes to be, in order to kind of remove the notion of like this one man as an individual being, right? And so I think what Freud kind of does in these moments is he does help to give some frames for what I'm thinking about, but of course at the same time we recognize that, again, as I said in the paper, Freud is not talking to me, right? Freud is thinking in a certain kind of bourgeois European moment, right? And at the same time, what's also interesting is that simultaneous to Freud writing, the slave trade is still happening, right? There are these moments where a real on-the-ground understanding of his theories would be the understanding of the black person, right? So for me, I'm kind of trying to think through literature, through culture, through media, what happens when I peel back the layers of these men and their performances and actually begin to find who kind of give them, who kind of profess to them what might be called genius. What's interesting about your moment around Frederick Douglass is that Douglass kind of does an interesting thing in the chapter where I write about him, in that the mother is also kind of in gender flux. So basically what happens is that there's a moment in his second autobiography where he talks about how he was flipping through an almanac and he sees a picture of a pharaoh. For what it's worth, Douglass's mother dies when he's quite young, around 8 years old, and he says, when my mother died, it was as if it was the death of a stranger. She would walk 12 miles one way to see him at night and put him to sleep, and then he wouldn't see her again. So she dies when he's about 8 years old. And so his recollections of her are quite hazy, for what it's worth. Nevertheless, as an adult, he's flipping through this almanac, and he sees a picture of an Egyptian pharaoh, and he says, that's my mother. My mother looks like this pharaoh. Again, with the understanding that he's saying, I really only saw my mother at night. She would come put me to sleep. Again, he's probably no more than 2 or 3 years old, right? But he sees this picture of the pharaoh and says, that pharaoh looks like my mom. I'm interested in that. I'm interested in Douglass saying, I have a hazy recollection of my mother, but if I were to say she looked like someone, she would look like this pharaoh, right? And of course, this is interesting because he's saying my mother looks like this man, right? At the same time, there's another moment where he's talking about this fight where he's fighting for his freedom. And he says that the slave master was a snake and I was a cat. To me, what's interesting is that given the kind of Egyptology that we know, cats are very important to Egypt, right? So on the one hand, that kind of feline, feminine figure of the cat is Douglass, at the same time that he also can read his lineage through the pharaoh, right? So even for Douglass, the mother is a kind of flux space, even around certain kinds of gender constructs. And again, I'm interested in how do we arrive at these notions of genius where we might be able to chart it through the black feminine, through the maternal, right? And see that in some ways, the making of these men who we would read as genius actually is indebted to these women, right? And so I think that in those ways, the Marvin Gaye certainly is playing with that because the father is the father, this kind of patriarch, but also is cross-dressing, right? So that kind of flux is going on too, right? And even for what it's worth, even he says, my father was a great singer, and I always sang my heart out to please him, right? So even there, that kind of gender flux, that kind of gender anxiety is even existent there, right? But again, I'm kind of trying to chart how these men are working through that, but also trying to chart how we might reconceptualize genius to see that it might begin with the feminine or the maternal.
Thank you for that. That was one of the things that kind of seemed to keep coming back to me was trying to track the object that was the black feminine throughout the book. So that really kind of helped to give some context to it. In terms of genius, so genius and blackness, we're qualifying genius in this context. What to you is black genius? Why the necessity to other this brand of genius from other types? I can think of a billion reasons, but I'm curious about yours.
That is a great question in part because I don't know the answer. I have been thinking a lot about what Black genius might be. In another moment, I referenced, perhaps again serendipitous to thinking about Donny Hathaway. There's a live album that Donny Hathaway has where he's about to cover a song by Stevie Wonder. And he says, "From the black pool of genius."
Yes, go on, go on.
Yeah. I have been thinking a lot about maybe if that is what I'm getting at. Like that there's a black pool, and in that black pool there's genius, right? I think one of the reasons that I have anxiety about qualifying Black genius is because I think I worry about, for lack of a better term, I think I worry about it becoming trademarked. And what I mean by that is that, like, if I tell you this is Black genius, then every time you see it, you'll be like, oh yes, that's it. And I'm worried of that because I think that it would mean that my work is kind of rendered obsolete, in part because I'm saying, whereas I'm totally grateful for Frederick Douglass writing 3 autobiographies, that gratitude doesn't negate the fact that I'm also totally invested in the fact that he says, my mother knew how to read. My mother, the germ of that rumor is the beginning of whatever we might call Frederick Douglass's genius, right? And so even that germ is not something that we would typically render genius. You know, being able to read. You know, in the case of even someone like Ralph Ellison, you know, for me in the chapter, the genius is by way of a riddle, right? And so I think one of the reasons why I'm wary of saying this is Black genius is because I think that certainly in the society we live in now, it can kind of get trademarked, and we can then say, oh, okay, yeah. And the other things that might be genius would then be thrown by the wayside because it doesn't have a look or it doesn't have a sound. And so I think when Donny Hathaway says the black pool of genius, I think that that's what I've been sitting with a lot more as a possibility for what I might mean when I think about genius. I think the other thing, too, about genius that also maybe makes me wary of kind of giving it the definition is because the idea itself is coming out of a certain kind of European Enlightenment thinking, right? And so yeah, so so then in those ways, you know, we may not think of, say, slaves sewing rice into their hair as a genius act, right? Because it doesn't have the look of what we oftentimes understand genius to be, right? Again, Frederick Douglass's mother being able to read, and again, the fact that he's not even sure if she could read, but the fact that he says it was a rumor. I heard that my mother was the only one who could read, right? So I think in those ways, I try to be careful about it, but I think also in the work, I'm trying to say, like, what happens if we look at the ordinary thing as a genius act in order to make the possibility of what it is more capacious, right? That we could open up possibilities for what genius might be if we think no longer about the spectacular, but maybe think about the ordinary.
So with that being said, this idea of trademarking around this, this idea and being cautious of it, I think many of Marvin Gaye's fans would consider him to be genius. So would you say that he's an example of that? And are there moments in your work, because I want to get to the book, are there moments in that chapter that you can pull out that exemplify that without limiting it to this is the single dimension in which Black genius exists?
Yeah. That's also a great question. I mean, I think that in some ways, so there's another time where the etymology of genius suggests that it's like the spirit or like the zeitgeist, right? And so for me, I think one of the reasons why I would make the claim that Marvin Gaye is a genius is because, especially if I'm thinking about what's going on in the early 70s around like music at that moment, that in some ways Marvin Gaye is kind of tapping into the spirit of the moment because, again, Isaac Hayes is producing Shaft. Donny Hathaway is producing Come Back Charleston Blue, right? So there's something going on around the spirit of the moment, right? That would suggest that, it's not just that Marvin Gaye is tapping in, but Isaac Hayes is tapping in. Minnie Riperton is tapping in. A lot of people are tapping into the spirit of the moment, right? And so I think that in those ways, it's not to reduce him and say, oh, no, he couldn't be genius. I mean, he could be. And again, in my book, he is, right? But again, it's also to say that, like, what was going on culturally in the moment that would make all these people be so invested in, even Donny Hathaway at one point, which is why I mentioned him talking about, Stravinsky and Ravel, he's saying, I've been listening to all this music and I think I want to write a symphony. And I believe he calls the symphony life, right? So there is something, Roberta Flack, who is also someone who is very much interested, and I say that about Roberta Flack and Donny Hathaway because in some ways, again, this is a moment of like genius and the spirit. I'm very interested in like the Howard Music Department. Donny Hathaway comes out of that department, Roberta Flack, Jesse Norman, Richard Smallwood. Like, what's going on at Howard Music Department?
What's in the water?
Right,
Yes.
right, So again, like that, it might be something like the spirit, right? That there's something that's inhabiting these spaces where people are getting inspiration, influence that that might compel them to do these works that we would consider genius, right? And so again, I think in some ways it is a move from like away from like the individual, right? Which again I think is like kind of a mode of that kind of Enlightenment thinking, to think more broadly about like what's happening among people at these moments. So again, Marvin Gaye, even if you want to say that Motown is genius at that moment, right? Because so much is being produced out of Motown. They're about to make films. They're moving to California, right? All these things are happening at once. So I would say in those ways, yes, he is a genius. But I would also say that maybe that genius is happening because there's something going on in the air.
I like this idea. I like that you give life to these ideas of like the spirit and in the air. And it also makes me think, with Howard University, the Marian Anderson connection for the Easter Sunday performance ended up happening on the steps in Lincoln Memorial. Originally, that whole concert series was sponsored by Howard University and was supposed to happen at DAR Constitution Hall. And then folks at Howard, folks around DC got together, pooled the money, and now we have that watershed performance that we all associate with her. So I think you may be onto something.
Thanks.
I know I don't have a lot more time, and I have so many questions for you. I want to talk about the titles of the chapters of the book. Okay. This is the book, by the way. You all need to run to get it. It is so fabulous. The titles of the chapters of the book feel like wordplay,
Yes.
which is laced throughout the text, which I absolutely enjoyed. But they also seem to suggest a type of duality and perhaps tension, which has come up when we're discussing the Black feminine, when we're discussing this idea of genius. The chapter titles, by the way, Color, Blackness, Read, Frederick, Travel, Ralph, Man, Marvin, Woman, Gan, Love, Kendrick, Study, and Us. Particularly in the chapters Man and Woman, this sense of duality and tension feels heightened, and it calls to mind Hortense J. Spiller's particular brand of duality, body and flesh. Can you share with us the intentionality behind this choice and what was left unsaid with the choice?
Of the chapter titles?
Yes.
Yes. So there's kind of a pragmatic answer and a theoretical answer, so I'll provide both. Pragmatically, the chapter titles are sparse because the writing is dense. So I kind of wanted to play on, very sparse chapter titles to prepare you for what will be dense writing, for the most part. And so it's just, a word, a dash, and then the name. So the second half of the chapters are the names of the people that the chapters are about. That's the pragmatic reason. The theoretical reason was, at one point I was thinking about how the word before the dash, so color, read, travel, man, woman, love, study, might be what brings about the melancholy. Such that then on the other side, we see like that melancholy turns into that genius of the named person. And so, again, in the case of, say, Frederick Douglass, I call the chapter Read Frederick because on the one hand, he is saying that, my love of letters is because of this rumor I heard about my mother being able to read. But then there's another moment where Frederick Douglass says, now that I know how to read, that I have literacy, I know all the ills of slavery. So I wouldn't wish that I think he said something effective like, I wouldn't wish it on the meanest reptile, right? So the ability to read is both a side of the melancholy for him, right, and a side of the genius for him, right? The same thing I would say about the other people. Again, in the case of, say, Marvin Gaye, Man, right? That trouble man is a moment where he can kind of narrate his childhood, right? Or what I'm envisioning as a narration of his childhood at the same time that in order to narrate it, one must have to relive that trauma, right? So that kind of thing. I did a book event last year, and my conversation partner said something to me that I never thought about, but I think also may be an interesting way to answer this question. He said to me that in his mind, to your point about what's missing, was that by not listing their last names, I leave open the possibility that the women that I reference can fill in the last name. I was blown away by that idea. Kanohi Nishikawa at Princeton University. I was like, oh, I never thought about it that way. So, for him, he's like, Man Marvin, that maybe his last name could then be Jackson or Anderson, right? I just never thought about that, right? So I think that in those ways, you're writing the book and kind of have this tunnel vision, but then it gets out into the world and people see things that you don't see. So when he offered that, I said, oh, that's a completely different way for me to think about how I might see the chapter titles, and one that I think is really, not to be too on the nose, genius, right? Right, to think about that as an idea. But yeah, partly, for the sake of being sparse, but also kind of really think about melancholy and genius and how that might manifest. The other thing, too, for what it's worth, is that also each of the words before the dash could be nouns or verbs. Although woman is not necessarily a noun or a verb, again, like in some ways, I'm thinking about in that chapter, what it means to be womanish, right? So in those ways also, before the dash, it's like, the noun of color and to color, read and to read. But yeah, that was how I thought about the chapters. And again, as I've talked to people about it, more ideas emerge for what might be there that I didn't see.
Thank you for that. How are we doing on time? Okay. Then let's plug you, shall we?
Okay.
So towards the end of the talk, we got to hear a little bit about how your work intersects with Donny Hathaway, Roberta Flack. What else do you have coming up where we can enjoy more from your brilliance?
So I'm currently writing a book about Roberta Flack. It's called Be Real Black for Me, which is a reference to her record with Donny Hathaway. The impetus for the project is there was a documentary in 2015 called Killing Me Softly. It was done by in the UK. And there's a moment in the documentary where they're interviewing Dionne Warwick. And she makes this move that sat with me for a long time and really kind of became the germ of the project. She says something to the effect of, Roberta has a clear, haunting, and soothing voice. Aretha makes you sweat, Roberta makes you think. I have been very intrigued by that idea of Roberta Flack's voice making one think, but also Aretha's voice making one sweat, right? And in some ways, these works, although they are separate, are in conversation. In part because there was another documentary about Roberta Flack, the PBS American Master series, and throughout the documentary, her former drummer keeps saying, Roberta Flack was a genius, but no one knew what to do with her. I'm very much, again, it's all on the nose, but I'm very much intrigued by that. And so Be Real Black for me is thinking about Roberta Flack, and as a kind of the shape of the chapters is I'm thinking through her first 4 albums. So First Take, Chapter 2, Quiet Fire, and Killing Me Softly. What's interesting about Roberta Flack, and this is something I've talked to my mentor Mary Helen Washington about, is that in terms of her public persona, what we know most about her is really her music. And so in some ways, I have gone about trying to fill in what we may or may not know about her. And so part of what I'm trying to do is think about it kind of in the vein of Audre Lorde as a kind of biomythography, where I'm kind of trying to draw out things that are known, things that I can kind of speculate on based on the music that are helpful to me writing that project. I'm in the throes of writing it now. The manuscript is due next summer, so I am writing it. But yeah, Be Real Black for me about the matter of Roberta Flack. The Donny Hathaway is a part of another project that's still yet undetermined. But in that chapter, as I said in the talk, I'm thinking about how he listens. He grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and there's a lot of kind of anecdotal evidence that says, you know, at like 8 or 9 years old, he could play Handel's Messiah. In kind of combing the archives at the Moreland Spingarn at Howard, there's all of this interesting data that says things like, he was so far advanced in the music department that professors were like, we really can't teach you. Like, you're really advanced. And so he would actually end up helping his classmates. Part of what I'm trying to think through with that chapter is, again, that kind of genius thing that's happening at Howard. But also thinking about, it's kind of a parallel story. So on the one hand, Donny Hathaway, people like Bert Flack are coming out of Howard and are doing music that is not technically the Howard University Music Department's curriculum. And what I mean by that is there are all these like kind of interesting stories that are told. Richard Smallwood tells one too, where he says, you know, when we would be in the music rooms practicing, we would be playing like gospel or the blues or jazz. And they would have someone standing at the door of the room because if a security guard walked past and heard them, they could get kicked out of school. So I'm interested in like the classical and the vernacular. You know, what does it mean for Donny Hathaway to write a song for you and interpret Liszt? And again, for what it's worth, he's also saying, like, I was listening to Stravinsky, I was listening to Ravel, you know, he's playing Handel's Messiah, you know, that kind of thing. Again, Roberta Flack is also listening to Bach and Chopin. He references Coltrane listening to Ravel. You know, Charles Mingus is listening to classical music. You know, Mary Lou Williams. It's kind of like a broad conversation around the classical and vernacular. But some of the entry points to that, too, is also thinking about, and here again, kind of trying to work through these parallel structures. Marian Anderson again emerges. When Marian Anderson was touring in Germany and singing Lieder, there are all of these newspaper articles that say, when she sang, people were like, is she German? She really mastered the Lieder in such a way, she and other black opera singers mastered the Lieder in such a way that people were like, you know. So in some ways, this notion of like mastery of the classical tradition, you know, what it means that Donny Hathaway is listening to all these things and reinterpreting it through the lens of, say, R&B and soul music is really interesting to me. And also how that kind of transfers into the modern moment. So, for example, if you listen to Alicia Keys' You Don't Know My Name, there's a flourish right before, ooh, you don't know my name. That's Chopin, right? There's a song by En Vogue called Love You Crazy, where they sample Tchaikovsky, The Nutcracker. Right? So you know, Janelle Monáe has a moment where she samples, I believe, Debussy's Clair de Lune. Right, so what's going on, the spirit. What is it about R&B music at a certain moment where like all these people are like reinterpreting classical music? right? What's it telling us about the classical and the vernacular? So that's another project that I have in mind. So as you can see, like in the book, I'm very much interested in sound. In these next project, I'm kind of running with sound and running with music, which is why I was saying I'm kind of interested in these close listening exercises, where, you know, in some ways, I'm not just kind of plumbing their archives, but also plumbing my own. So as I was saying in the paper, you know, I'm in Durham, North Carolina, randomly at a teacher's play-in. The woman goes and plays. Again, I know I've heard Lish before, right? She plays and gets to that first. I'm like, no one has written about this? like, oh my goodness, like, has anyone else paid attention to this, right? So again, it's like not only just plumbing Hathaway's archive, but also knowing that, like, if not for my parents playing him in the house, I would not have even known that flourish was his, right? So again, it's kind of like that kind of in and out, the biomythography, you know, the kind of autobiography. So those are the next projects that I'm working on.
I so enjoy your brain and the connections that you're able to make between these, what society would have us believe are disparate ideas.
Yeah.
So your work, I think, is really crucial for lots of reasons.
Thank
but
you.
I'd also like to mention your background is, you have an undergraduate in architecture,
Yeah.
right?
Thought I was going to be an architect.
Yeah, you're just, your work
Right.
is just so deftly interdisciplinary. And I think as someone who gets to work with music research a lot, it's a real treat getting
Thank
to
you.
read the way that you put this together and getting to hear just the way all of this is ticking. So
Thank you.
thank you for spending time with
Thank
us
you.
and sharing your wonderful, brilliant thoughts.
Thank you.
And now I'll stop hogging you so others can ask you questions.
That's right. So I have the mic in case somebody wants to ask a question. There you go.
You talked about Marvin's, I'll call it his later work, but where does the early part of his career come in? You know, stubborn kind of fella and hitchhike, and it's such different vibe.
I don't really write about that in the chapter, but that is kind of integral to the story. So in terms of thinking about the late work, this album happens after what's going on, which is the total shift, right? So, and there are a couple of other things that happen. So again, as we think about the spirit of the moment. So, you know, he's kind of writing and singing pop music. So stubborn kind of fella, hitchhike, that kind of thing. The Vietnam War happens. He also joins the Air Force and leaves, right? So he has some semblance of an understanding of like serving in the armed services. What's interesting because basically when he's in the Air Force, he feigns like he goes crazy. So they're like, get out of here, right? And so what's interesting about the Trouble Man, right. So what's interesting about the Trouble Man moment is, again, it comes after what's going on. But there are a couple of things happening. So again, it's like the soundtracks are happening all at once. There's all this kind of interesting social stuff going on. And Stevie Wonder is using different technology to make his music. So he's using the Moog, M-O-O-G. And so, kind of, again, the spirit of Motown. But Marvin Gaye is watching this and thinking like, oh, like, I think I can do that, right? And so, in some ways, what's going on really is the thing that sets up the latter half of his career, because he really is more interested in, what then would be concept albums, right? And I would say, even though certainly near the end of his career, we get like, say, Let's Get It On and I Want You, which again are pop. They're concept albums, but I mean, certainly they're of a different ilk than What's Going On and Trouble Man. The early part of his career is not as important to me, only because I'm more interested in what happens in that moment of the shift. The moment that he moves to California and he records this album, and again, he's listening to Gershwin in those moments in LA. But yeah, certainly, those early years are important because those early years also are the moments where, again, he's really learning how to manipulate the falsetto, right? So he's learning how to change his voice because, again, those early years, he's singing way out of his range. So as you mentioned, Stubborn Kind of Fella, that little pre-chorus where he goes, do, 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 down. It's a little too high for him, right? So again, like he's already learning how to change the voice in those early years that I think manifests later in something like Trouble Man.
Any
So
other
I don't
question?
write about it, but yeah.
And Megan mentioned about his voice regarding the background vocals that he would do. How did he come up with that concept?
Of the background vocals he
Right.
recorded. So this also was interesting by him. So like say on I Want You, he's recording like hundreds of voice background, right? Again, these are moments where he almost is kind of trying to think of the voice as a chorus, right? And I think again, because he's listening to people like Bach, he's listening to people like Beethoven, he's thinking in a kind of symphonic register, right? But again, there are other people too. So like, there's a short interlude on Inner Visions where before Golden Lady, that's kind of has like a choral register. So that's what I'm saying, like at Motown, in the moment of a kind of spirit thing that's happening, like everyone is kind of thinking more, again, Donny Hathaway is like, I think I want to make symphonies. So yeah, he's thinking a lot about layering. And of course, there's a way that kind of recording prowess then makes legible someone like Michael Jackson. And the kind of intensity of like him recording, like say, Wanna Be Starting Something. Right, he's doing all these layered background vocals, harmonizing that kind of thing. So he really kind of does innovate that kind of thing. Even though, again, on Trouble Man, the music is very, very sparse. So again, it's very much, in these ways, in terms of the symphonic, it's a lot more orchestral. Again, Trouble Man is really the only song on the album where he's singing for an extended period of time. But yeah, like, he's thinking a lot more about these kinds of, I'd say like big sounds, the kind of symphonic, choral register in this moment. Yeah.
I was really struck by when you said the practice of Black listening, and I really appreciated how you invited us into a listening process with you through the course of your talk, and I wondered if you could say a little more about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, in the same way that I would say, Marvin Gaye is an archival singer, I think that in many ways, Black people are archival listeners. Right? And so, this manifests in a number of different ways. A perfect example is, to talk about Marvin Gaye, when Robin Thicke records Blurred Lines, I'm like, I think one of the reasons why it really is because people are like, oh, got to give it up, right? Right. Hence the suit, right? Right. Right. It's like, it's like, yeah, we can hear it. We know, perhaps, I think although he won the case, Ed Sheeran, whatever that song is, I don't remember the name of it, but and Let's Get On. I mean, again, people are like, we can hear. Even if it's not that you're directly sampling it or interpolating it, you have definitely been influenced, right? But I think the other thing about Black listening practices that's so interesting to me, and it's a conversation I've had before with people just as someone who sang, is that, and this is maybe more generally a listening practice, but I'll say it's a Black listening practice only because of the Apollo. I'm always interested in people who cannot hear tones, who, if you were to get up on the Apollo stage and sing Whitney Houston wrong, they know it. immediately. Like they know that is not how the song goes, even if it is the case. Right, a big cane comes out, just get off the stage, right? Sandman, right? Right? It's a very elaborate spectacle, right? But that there is something about the listening practice that, again, I may not be able to sing the Whitney Houston to you, but because I know how it sounds when you get up on stage and you sing it wrong, I know that it's wrong, right? And so, again, as I'm thinking about Black listening practices, that's something too that's also intriguing me, which is why I'm saying with the Donny Hathaway, it's so well done, right? It's so subtle what he does. What's also interesting about that is that A Song for You is actually a cover. The man's name, it was originally written by a white artist, Leon Russell. Go listen to Leon Russell, and then go listen to Donny Hathaway, and you'll see like it.
They're both so good.
Right. I mean, or again, even as I'm talking about Roberta Flack, Roberta Flack or Nina Simone, like so much of their discography is covers, right? So a song like First Time Ever I Saw Your Face is a cover. No one knows who sang the original. I mean, so, right. Like she took the. Even if we take someone like Aretha Franklin's Respect, which was originally recorded by Otis Redding, you do not know. You don't think of Otis.
Ain't nobody come to see you, Otis.
Right. Or even right. Or even Aretha Franklin and Natural Woman, right? Carole King sings that. She reaps the material benefits of the cover, right? But like when you think about Natural Woman, you're like, that is Aretha Franklin's song, right? And of course, I would say, it comes full circle when Carole King gets the Kennedy Center honor and Aretha Franklin sings it to her, right? Where she's like, it is your song. It really is yours, right? So yeah, as I think about Black listening practices, again, I'm interested in that kind of both and, right? Where it's like somehow people, Roberta Flack is covering Bob Dylan. She's covering Suzanne Collins. Exactly, right? Where you wouldn't know that Bob Dylan sang it first, right? Again, Nina Simone, and again, even as I'm thinking about that kind of classical register, Nina Simone's Little Girl Blue borrows from Good King Wenceslas, right? Again, like all these moments where you're like, oh yeah, like they're listening in such interesting ways. And oftentimes playing music that we actually know. Like, I mean, it is really the American songbook, right? And we wouldn't even know who sang it first, right? I'm very intrigued by that, right? So I think, that the listening practice is both, how they're interpreting and how they're reimagining, but also that people listen, and even if they don't have the acumen to sing it well, they do know what good singing is, or they know that you're not singing it right, right. And so you got to get off stage.
Well, more so than a question, I'd like permission to share, and it has to do with Marvin Gaye. Mm-hmm. The day that he died, at that time, I was Melvin Lindsay, who created The Quiet Storm. I was his weekend and fill-in host. And I remember being in the car coming from the event, because I was working at WHR, Howard University, HU, you know. Yeah, we know. And I was just recalling that because we were sitting here talking about the intricacies of Marvin, and I remember being in the cab, because they didn't have Uber back then, and I heard that he had passed, and I remember calling Jesse Fax, who was the program director, and what we did is we just opened up the music library, and from 7 to midnight that night on The Quiet Storm, we just played his music, and it was so ironic because it was April Fool's Day,
yeah.
And it was
That's
the
what's so
day
crazy
before
about, yeah.
his birthday.
His birthday, yeah. That day, he would turn 45.
Right, and I remember that because people were just so heartbroken. Yeah, I mean, and what you said about I Want You, what I really liked about I Want You Now, Let Everything Go, that was a song, if you think about the song, most of it did not rhyme. If you listen to the words, it was just him talking straight from the heart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you see that too on the album Here, My Dear.
Yeah, right.
A lot of
Well,
music
that
is-
was a whole other
Yeah, so-
reason he did that.
Whole other thing. Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, Here, My Dear too, a lot of music doesn't rhyme.
Thank you for allowing me not to ask a question.
No,
Yeah.
no, but yeah, but I do write about that, again, like that kind of the cruel irony. He's born April 2nd, 1939 and dies April 1st, 1984. Right? That he would have literally just celebrated his birthday the next day. And again, it's April Fool's Day. Again, yeah, because I would imagine people thought it was a joke. Right? And in the manner in which which is probably also why now people don't do April Fool's jokes anymore, right? I mean,
My birthday's April Fool's. They do.
oh, they do. I'm sorry.
Well, I think we have had a wonderful evening, and please give them a big round of applause. Thank you so much.